the topic that I have chosen is assessments for learning. So the title might create a confusion or an anxiety among you, as everyone considers assessments for evaluation, but I have chosen the topic assessments for learning. So how exactly the assessments are going to help the students in further learning, how assessments are going to help the students in getting motivated for learning as well, how assessments are going to uh, you know uh, demotivate the students if they are not properly planned. So basically speaking, so what is assessment? So generally, as I said, people consider it as evaluation, but it's not correct. Assessment is exactly the process of defining, selecting, designing, collecting, analyzing, and interpreting and getting the information on students' learning. So it's not just evaluating, but understanding them, how their learning has happened, is what exactly the assessment is mean. Now, when we are saying that the assessment includes various parameters, not just simply evaluation, how do we perform or how do we conduct assessments? So for this, we have various assessment methods available, and these assessment methods, along with the strategies and the technologies, which are going to help us as instruments for collecting the above said information or for conducting the above said assessments. And as we are talking about outcome based education, here we need to map the assessments with the outcomes. So here, when I'm talking about assessments, I mean to say that here we are going to plan the assessments such that we are going to assess the course learning outcomes. So just to recap, so here we need to understand the outcome based education and outcome based accreditation. So when we are talking about the OBE perspective, as the professional engineering institutions eagerly look for getting accreditation, and the accreditation is an OBE accreditation. So here I'm going to talk about the outcome based education and how it is going to help us in getting outcome based accreditation. If you just look at the slide, you understand the OBE education is the focus for outcome based curriculum, which is a focus for outcome based teaching and learning, and which is a focus for outcome based assessment. Yes, as already I mentioned, the earlier sessions already spoke about the OBE, OBC, and OBLT. Today I'm going to talk about outcome based assessment. So this is the overall OBE framework. So just for a recap, already discussed the vision and mission of the institute, PEOs, right? The program outcomes and the course learning outcomes, session outcomes, and all this which maps to the curriculum and are implemented. Then comes the assessment. So here, how do we assess? The assessment begins from a course to the program to the institutional assessment. For us, when an institution is implementing outcome-based education, the assessment is the incremental. So our assessment actually begins with a course, and all the assessments of the courses together will go for the program assessments, and all the assessments of the program will help in the institutional assessment. And when we talk about OBE framework, it always speaks about a 360 degrees closed loop, and which always talks about an improvement. So there should be an improvement from an year to year, semester to semester. That is what exactly what the OBE talks about. So today we are going to much focus on how exactly a course need to be assessed. And if time permits, I will move on to the program assessment as well as the institutional assessment too. So when I'm talking about assessment, so yes, the traditional assessment is nothing but conducting an examination which will have some marks, and students will give some answers and will give some score, and finally we will be giving a grade to the student. But yes, as we know, the OBE assessment is nothing but attainment calculation, and attainments calculation is completely mapped with the outcomes that which we already have specified. So how it works? So we can see that we are going to specify and obtain the course outcomes. Then we are going to map the course outcomes with the program outcomes. Then we are going to set an appropriate weightage for the CO assessment. Then we are going to measure whether the COs are attained through assessments given by the students. And finally, we do CO and PO attainment calculation. In fact, this is already discussed by the speaker yesterday. So now the types of assessment in OBE. So when we talk about OBE, we have a tool for the learning levels to be assessed, and the same learning levels are already as a part of the course outcomes when we design the course outcomes, right? So we have the Bloom's learning levels from remembering to the creating level. And when we plan some assessments, these assessments need to be for the various levels of the Bloom's as already mentioned with the course outcomes. So in simple, in general, for the Bloom's levels like remembering to applying, the fixed hour examinations are mostly used. Whereas coming to analyzing, evaluating and creating, these are the levels where the student has to apply his cognitive intelligence. The fixed hour examinations may not support. So for evaluating the student learning for the higher level of the Bloom's, so we have to give some, uh, problem-based learning assignments, capstone project, minor project, mini project, innovative projects, some, hands-on assignments has to be given or assessments has to be given. So this is how when you have a course outcome and the course outcome talks about a particular Bloom's level, and based on that particular Bloom's level assessment, we have to choose a kind of assessment. So moving forward, again, when we talk about outcome-based education assessment, to assess or to evaluate or to get the information related to the student learning, we majorly focus on two different kinds of assessments, which we call it as a direct assessment and indirect assessment. So we are not just going to depend only on the direct assessment like the traditional approach. Direct assessment in the sense, a student is given with some kind of assignments, assessments, some tests periodically, maybe at the end of the semester or at the end of the year, and student will answer the questionnaire and we will be giving score for that, and based on the score student will be getting a grade, and from that we calculate the mean, median or average grade of the class, and then the program, etc. So this is what exactly we do in the traditional approach, and this is in fact the direct assessment model wherein the student is evaluated, our student is defined or analyzed for his learning through the examinations. Whereas we also have to take another kind of assessment, and we call it as an indirect assessment, and which is a definite parameter in outcome-based education assessment. So what is this indirect assessment all about? An indirect assessment is nothing but the surveys, the feedbacks, which we take from the student on his learning. So here, the basic difference the diagram tells to you on the slide. The direct assessment is nothing but student is going to demonstrate his learning through the examinations or the assessments that the facilitator or the faculty or the teacher or the department has planned. Whereas coming to the indirect assessment, the student is going to describe their learning. So means, I'll take an example. Let me take a course, artificial intelligence, and that artificial intelligence have 5 course outcomes, which are defined at various levels of learning with the Bloom's work. Now the student with a survey or with a feedback will give his own understanding, his own learning of the particular course outcomes. So that particular survey reports are taken into consideration and we call that particular assessment as the indirect assessment. So the indirect assessments are basically through the surveys, through the feedbacks, and yes, we can also take an interview and record the indirect assessment as well. So finally, to understand, so to complete the assessment of OBE, so we need to perform the direct assessment and the indirect assessment. And this assessment should be for the course, for the program, as well as for the institution as well. So now, now let's look at how do we perform direct assessments in OBE. And mostly I will be concentrating on direct assessments here itself. So when I'm talking about direct assessments in OBE, as already I mentioned, wherein student demonstrates his learning. And for that, we have further categorization of the direct assessments, and we call it as formative and summative assessments. In simple to say, any assessment that takes place at the end of the semester or at a fixed time are called as summative assessments. And the in-class assessments are nothing but considered as the formative assessments. And of course, for the final grade calculation, the scores from formative and the scores from summative together will be taken into consideration. But now, when I'm talking about categorization of formative and summative assessments, there is some advantage with both the assessment models as well. The OBE major focuses on formative assessments and the traditional education system more focuses on summative examinations. The understanding over here is, as I said, the formative assessments are majorly considered when the sessions are going on during the semester, wherein the students, based on their performance, will further help them in getting their feedback and fine-tuning their learning. As well, the formative assessments will also give a direct feedback to the faculty on the student learning. So that's where formative assessments will always help in maximizing the student learning. Whereas coming to the summative assessments, as I mentioned, the summative assessments are majorly conducted at the end of the semester. In fact, when we consider our Indian education systems, the semester end examinations are summative exams. So which generally happens after the last working day. Students demonstrate and finally we give a grade. And we will not get any fine tuning, option for the student performance in summative tests. But whereas in formative tests, always we get it. And now the point, when do we do this formative test? As I said, it's throughout the course. And it's not going to be a one time, two time, and it always depends on the faculty decision. And already, as I mentioned, it identifies the gaps and improves learning. And as well, it supports the specific student needs as well. But whereas summative finally tells what exactly has happened. So that's where in outcome-based education, formative assessments always plays a vital role. And as a faculty member, we have to give more importance for the formative assessments, because formative assessments are not just for evaluating, but they're also going to help us in fine tuning our learning strategies, teaching strategies, as well as they're also going to give the feedback to the student in further improving their learning, understanding what is exactly they are missing, what is exactly they have not properly understood. So this is the clear classification that we should know. And this is what exactly we do whenever a course is allocated for us by the department or by the head of the department. So I think by this, every one of you had got a clear understanding between formative and the summative assessments. So now you might ask me a question. I know what are the various summative tests we can do? What are the various formative tests we can do? So here, both the slide shows rubrics. I'm going to talk about the rubrics, how rubrics are going to help us in further, uh, evaluating the assessments, right? Mostly the summative tests are nothing but the written tests. There will be some creative assignments, presentations, creating some portfolios like project portfolios, written reports, or coming up with project prototypes, or some practical examination, or a peer self-evaluation. This is what the summative tests, and they always happen at the end. But whereas the formative are nothing but the classroom discussion, as I said, in-class discussion, the checklist, some questionnaire, some progress notes, right? Whatever we discussed today, we ask them to come up with the progress notes, some self-evaluation, or sometimes students come up with an observation, right? So all these are taken into consideration for the student learning. So when I'm talking about formative assessments, it need not be a quiz. It need not be an assignment. So it is your own mechanism to assess the student learning for the class, for the week, for the topic. And there are, n number of such approaches that are available, strategies that are available to conduct formative tests, and it always lies with the freedom of the faculty member. And as well, the exams are also going to, the assessments are also going to create motivation to the student when we change the strategy. Say, every time we keep conducting quizzes, they lack motivation. Always come up with a new way of assessment. And the new way of assessment will always create some gamification in the student. And that creates some anxiety and motivation for the student to give that particular assessment. So that's why even the kind of assessments we conduct need to be changed. So that's why as a faculty member, we always need to choose a different strategy, different mechanism to assess the student from the basket of testing strategies that are available. So now a point is, yes, as NBA become a permanent member of Washington Accord, and OB has become mandatory to get NBA accreditation, and every institution requires OB accreditation. So that's where now every institution started practicing OB, and the moment OB has come, every institute started saying the faculty member, your question paper should be OB enabled. And when we say OB enabled, people say that, again, the question should have a Bloom's level. And these days, when we see any question paper, there will be a question, and a question will be mapped to a Bloom's level, which is further mapped to a course outcome. But there is no clear, what I can say, understanding, or there is no clear policy that is defined other than, showcasing the Bloom's levels. So now, when we are planning questions for an outcome-based, education system, we need to understand 2 points. That is, the questions are of two types actually. One is a closed question. The other one is an open question. See here, I'll give an example. When we come with a keyword, Bloom's keyword, explain. So people always consider that the explain keyword means it is CO2, it is understanding level. But the same explain keyword can be used, and we can design a question which falls at analyzing level. So means what I mean to say is, it always depends on whether you are defining a lower level question or a higher level question, whether you are defining a closed question, whether you are defining an open question. And open question is always at the higher level, that is more than apply. When we want to give a question for analyze, evaluate, and create, the questions should be always open-ended. When you are giving a question for the lower level, that is remember, understand, and apply, the question should be of closed for you to give an understanding. So there is an example here you can see. There is a closed question for the lower level. What it says, what are the stages of cell division? So there is a closed bound for the question for the student to respond, demonstrate. The same question, look at the higher level. Given the medical data before you, would you say this patient is intoxicated or suffering from a diabetic reaction? So here, what is happening? There is some data given and we are asking to apply, and further the student has to analyze, that is whether he is suffering from a diabetic reaction or not. A higher level question that has come from the one that is already. So it's the same question, look at here, both are same, right? Here we are asking them to demonstrate the stages. Here with the given data, apply and analyze. The other side, when I talk about an open-ended question, just look at, he said, what is an example of an adjective, right? So when this question comes, it's open-ended. Student has a freedom of taking an example of his choice and demonstrate what exactly an adjective is. But still, this is a lower level. Coming to the higher level, what it says, what are some ways we might solve the energy crisis, right? So for this, he has to demonstrate his understanding, applying and analyzing, and finally he has to evaluate as well. So a simple example for you to understand how to give a closed-ended question, how to give a lower level, how to give an higher level, how a question can be converted from the lower level to higher level. So in planning questions, the Bloom's taxonomy always will help us as a tool. So the point is, when we are designing a question paper, it consists of some questions. And how do you decide a question? The question has to be used, or we have to prepare a question which helps us in evaluating the student for some defined goals. The defined goals are nothing but the course outcomes. So please keep the course outcomes handy. Look at what exactly the course outcomes are defined. And when you are giving a question, see that whether your question paper, whether your question is mapped into the course outcome and covering all the aspects of the course outcome, as well covering the level of learning that is defined by the course outcome. There is another aspect in outcome-based assessment. We call it as question paper fitness. So there is a course defined with some course outcomes. Now we are giving an assessment, and there should be an evaluation that has to take place whether this particular question paper which is designed is actually meeting the goals of the course outcomes. If not, the outcomes are defined at a particular level and you are assessing at a lower level. So then, it is not quality education. Sometimes the outcomes are at lower level and the questions are planned at a higher level. And this is nothing but, we are, not doing justice to the students. So that's where the question paper fitness plays a vital role. So in OBE, this is an additional, what I can say, checkpoint wherein the question papers will always be checked for fitness. And we always, as a setter, we need to ensure that the questions are defined to achieve the well-defined goals. When we say well-defined goals and outcomes, no need of, be an higher expertise in, defining an OBE question, as the OBE, Bloom's taxonomy tool is already available, which helps us with the action verbs, which falls into the various levels of learning. by using them, a question can be always framed. See here, this is an assessment always I give whenever I do an in-house session. So this is something you can take as a self-assessment for yourself. And if someone is a head of the department, you can always do this particular case study for your faculty member as well. This is a very simple assessment, and this helps you in understanding whether your faculty are able to prepare the questions as per the outcomes and as per the goals of the course. The instructions are simple. You can just look at, choose a subject that you are teaching. You can just give this, prepare, take a Word document and just hand over to your faculty member. You can ask them to choose a subject they are currently teaching. Ask them to choose a topic which could be covered in two, 3 classes to teach. Take one concept. Yesterday I'm talking about heuristic techniques. Ask them to take AI heuristic techniques. Then ask them to write assessment questions. How many? 2 for each Bloom's level. That is starting from remember. So from the same topic, ask them to write 2 questions for the recall or remember, 2 questions for understanding, 2 questions at the apply, 2 questions at the analyze, 2 questions at the evaluate, and 2 questions at the create. If a faculty is able to, design a question from the same topic for the various levels of the Bloom's taxonomy, right? Then we can understand that yes, that particular faculty is, ready to design a question paper which fits to the course that is designed. Otherwise, those faculty requires a certain kind of training. So here, as I mentioned, when they are preparing questions, so just before my slide says, the questions need to be closed, the questions need to be open-ended, right? So they can be lower order, higher order, as the Bloom strategy says. This is an assessment that, can be taken for, the blooming, the assessments, enabling the faculty to develop assessments in relation to the Bloom's taxonomy. So now, as I said, when we are talking about outcome-based education assessment, actually rubrics plays a very vital role. So we need to prepare the rubrics. The rubrics helps the students in understanding the expectations of the evaluator. The rubrics will always helps the students in understanding the transparency of the evaluation. As well, rubrics helps in reducing the evaluation error. So that's where for the formative assessments or for the summative assessments, we always need to design a rubric. Mostly we see the autonomous institutions or any educational institution for the sake, they always ask you for giving a schema. But schemas is an age-old process. What is that required is a rubric. That rubric helps in properly assessing the demonstration of the student by reducing the assessment error, as well as, even the student understands the expectation as well, right? So what is a rubric here? It's a systematic scoring guideline to evaluate the student's performance. And it need not be only the test. It might be the demonstration. It might be the problem solutions, portfolios, cases, etc. And this always helps the students in getting the consistent scores, and as well, it always helps them in even understanding why they have got a particular score also. But when I'm talking about this particular rubrics, actually rubrics are of various types. We have a kind of rubric, we call it as a holistic rubric, and the holistic is nothing but wherein we give a single score for the overall performance. We have analytic rubrics where the grading is broken down into the specific criteria with the levels of performance provided. I will give some examples for you. There is another rubric which we call it as a developmental rubric, which is nothing but a subset of analytical rubric. And then we have a checklist. As well, we also have the scaling as well. Here, when I'm talking about the various types of the rubrics, which I'm going to explain you in detail, There is again a lot of confusion for the people between a rubric and a scaling, because in the traditional approach, we are very much, habituated in using scaling mechanism as well. I'm going to explain you the basic difference also. Yes, this is another slide to talk about, which is a digital bloom. So as the earlier speakers spoke about, right, the technology has become a part of our teaching strategy. Say when I'm talking about the technology became a part of our teaching strategy, and we have some course outcomes defined, and the course outcomes are defined at a particular level of strategy. And we also need to be matured enough in using a particular technology for demonstrating a particular course outcome at a particular level, right? I can't use a YouTube video and demonstrate a course outcome or teach a course outcome at create level. That's never possible. And I can't use a YouTube video for demonstrating the analyzing level of learning strategy. So there are various technologies. So we need to map the particular technology for a particular level of blooms. And when we are teaching a particular course outcome at a particular level, so the technologies that fall into that particular level has to be taken. This is a very simple example, and we have a big basket of such technologies that are available, which can be used for demonstrating the various levels of the blooms, and I call it as a digital blooms. The same blooms, but not just talking about the teaching strategies, but we talk about the technology uses for the various levels of learning. So further moving, as I'm talking about scaling versus rubric. So what is scaling here? So when I said a rubric, mostly people understand, rubric is always two-dimensional. Yes, the basic analytic rubric, which is widely used, is two-dimensional, and even scaling is also two-dimensional. And when it comes to the scaling, what we do is, the scaling always results in meeting a particular criteria. So it is never going to meet more than one criteria, and it meets a particular criteria, and a particular criteria will have a particular score, and we'll take it that. We call it as scaling. So if I give an example, we might take a feedback of this FDP, and we might ask you that from a scale of 0 to 10, please give your feedback. So we say 0 being the minimum and 10 being the maximum. We always give, right? When we take the Uber ride, right? Cab book, and at the end we get a feedback, right? We give the scaling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is nothing but a scaling assessment or the scaling evaluation. But whereas when we talk about the rubric will have a definition. So not just a simple goal, not just a simple parameter. It will have the definition of that particular parameter. And that is what the rubrics is. The same scaling is now converted into a rubric. So there it says below expectation, meets expectation, and exceeds expectation. And when I'm talking below expectation, every one of us will have our own definitions. Say, I'm a man, I never get satisfied. And for me, the exceeds expectation might become a below expectation. There is a person who is, very casual. For him, a below expectation can become an exceeds expectation also. So that's where there should be some bounds that has to be fixed. What exactly the below expectation is, what exactly the meets expectation is, what exactly the exceeds expectation is. So a clear definition should be mentioned. That is exactly the rubric. Hope by this you might have understand the difference between scaling and rubric. And in student assessment, we always need to use rubrics, not just scaling, because scaling will help the people in taking various definitions of their choice, whereas that particular choice will not be there in rubrics. So this is an scale you can look further. This is an initial assessment scale, further a bigger one. So poor, marginal, fair, good, and excellent. So no proper definitions. And this is a rubric. So you can see the difference. So a rubric, a scale further converting into the rubric. So as I said, why I'm giving this particular difference is most of us are well equipped, have a very good understanding of preparing scaling. But yes, now the OBE says that we have to use rubrics, and we should be in a position to convert a scale to a rubric. So I can't get deeper into that, where there are various literature available on internet which says that how a rubric has to be developed. There are also various tools that are available. I'll talk about that, where there are readily available rubrics which we can use by editing as per our requirement. So now moving further, the classification of the rubrics or the categorization of the rubrics, which I already spoke about. Let's take each rubric in place. So the analytic rubric. So the analytic rubric are the two-dimensional rubrics, and 90%, we use analytic rubric for our assessment. So we have a row, we have a column, and every row defines a particular, criteria of assessment, and the particular criteria of assessment will have various parameters in the column wise, and every cell will have a definition for that. And this analytic rubric is mostly in the tabular form, right? So this is what exactly the analytic rubric is. The earlier rubrics which I have shown, they are actually the analytic rubrics. Whereas coming to a developmental rubric, this is actually a subset of analytic rubric, and the name says developmental rubric. The developmental rubric is used to understand the progress of the task. Say, for example, a software project is getting developed, and the software project, say, has a timeline of, say, 1 year. So now, at any instance of the time, through the rubric, we can understand the progress level of the project, right? So we call this as the developmental rubric. Same means, today, we are at what level? So, if I take a building as an example, we are at, foundation level, we are at a slab level, or we are at, doing that, what I can say, the internal architects. So this is exactly called as a developmental rubric. So developmental rubric will always be progressive. And this rubric is used at various time intervals to understand the progress of the project. So this is what exactly the developmental rubric is all about. So it is a subset of analytic rubric, and as well it is a two-dimensional rubric in place. Then we have the other rubric, which we call it as a holistic rubric, and which is always one-dimensional. So what this holistic rubric is all about is, so I have a mostly, when we have a product in place, when we have a project in place, when we have some policy in place, when we are asked to give some feedback, so we are going to give a final feedback. So that whether we say whether it is above average, whether it is sufficient, whether it is developing, whether it is needs improvement, but we have a proper definition for them for giving that particular evaluation, and we call this as the holistic rubric. Hope you understand the difference between the developmental rubric and holistic rubric. Developmental rubric is during the development of the project, understanding the development level, and it is always incremental. But whereas holistic rubric is the one which is taken at the end. And always remember, holistic rubric is always only one-dimensional. We just give the final, understanding, the final feedback on that particular project. Say, some student has come up with a project, and finally we are giving his feedback. We can say whether it's above average, whether it's sufficient, developing, or it needs improvement. That's what we give, right? Most of you are, in fact, if I have to say, during your PhD, you always get, feedback during your reviews. And that is always a holistic rubric that you people will be getting. Okay, so further there is another rubric, and which we call it as a checklist, and which further we use mostly. This again a very traditional approach, traditional rubric available. The checklist is nothing but, again, we have the assessment parameters, and we'll have only the binary decisions saying true or false, or present or absent, yes or no. So such kind of rubrics are nothing but called a checklist. Whenever we apply for something, there will be a checklist, right? So whether all the attachments are in place, whether all the documents are in place, whether you have filled all the required data. So there will be a checklist. You have to mention yes, no. And sometimes, we have to give our health information. So we say yes, no. So all these examples are nothing but we call them as a checklist. So we have various kinds of the rubrics. As I said, the rubrics are analytic rubrics, widely used, and for our assessments, and mostly the preferable rubric for our assessments, because our assessment will have the various parameters, right? And we require the proper definition to make the student understand the faculty expectation. Okay, So now when I'm talking about these rubrics, now the question is, when these rubrics are to be developed, the rubrics are to be developed once the course is designed and ready to implement. And the rubrics need to be given to the students. The rubrics helps the student in understanding the expectation. I can give a simple example for you to start implementing is, most of the engineering curriculums will have a major minor project. For the major minor project, start using analytic rubric and give that analytic rubric to your students well in advance. And the analytic rubric will tell them, will make them understand that what kind of performance is going to really help them in getting a particular score, right? Say in terms of problem statement, when they are going to get the maximum score. In terms of literature survey, when they are going to get the, higher score. Means when you are going to get satisfied and when you are going to give, there should be a definition. So if their literature survey is incomplete, they will get a particular score. So the expectations of the evaluator are known to the student and student demonstrates accordingly. And if suppose you have given a 2 marks for them out of 10, the student will understand. He will not come back to you asking for why he got that particular score, because the rubric is already in place. So that's where rubrics are help us in improving the transparency of our assessment, in improving the justification of the assessment that we have done to the student as well. It also helps in reducing the assessment error, because we prepare the rubrics with a scaling, right? We can say 1 to 5 marks, we can say 11 to 15 marks, or 16 to 20. So that helps us in overcoming that particular assessment errors as well. So these are the various kinds of, the checklists as rubrics that are in place. And rubrics has to be widely used in outcome-based education assessment. So as I said, yes, developing the rubrics, getting expertise takes some time. So if someone is interested and want to use the rubrics, there are some platforms which are readily available, which gives us the templates, and just download the templates, and the copyrights are available. You can always edit as per your requirement. So these are various sites that are available, and from these sites you can take the rubrics and you can make your assessment more meaningful for the student. Okay, so once the rubrics are done, so as I already mentioned, I'm going to focus much on the direct assessment and making the assessment more meaningful, and the assessments to create motivation for the students. There are some scientific approaches which I want to discuss today. There is a scientific approach which talks about the 12 principles of assessment. I will brief you each point today. As well, I'm going to share you the research articles as well through email, okay, with the organizing people. The first basic principle talks about assessment should help the students to learn. Keep this as a goal. Okay, or as when you decide to conduct some assessment, like a quiz, like a role play, like a presentation, like a poster presentation, or maybe an assignment or an open book examination, first you get convinced yourself whether this assessment is going to help the students to learn. If not, do not go for that particular assessment. As I said, assessment is not for evaluation. Assessment is for the student to demonstrate what exactly they learned, right? Student to define themselves for their learning. So that's where first, as an examiner, you have to get convinced yourself. Moving to the next principle, assessment must be consistent with the outcomes of the course and what is taught and what is learned. This is something always, students gives the feedback. A teacher teaches to the understand level. Outcomes are planned to the apply level, and the questioning is at the apply level. So here, something which is not taught and something which is not learned is being asked. And this is never to happen to the student. So when you are expecting to give an assessment, yes, OBE says to give as per the outcomes, but as well, at the same time, if you have not taught, you're not supposed to give. So you have to ensure that the learning happens as per the outcomes, levels. And the question paper also need to be at that level itself as well. The third principle is various types of the assessment allows a range of different learning outcomes to be assessed. It also keeps the student interesting, as already I mentioned. This is a principle. Never always use the same kind of assessment that makes the people boring. People always want something new. Assess them in a new, different approach. There is another topic which I'm not going to cover today. We call it as a gamification of learning. There is a famous saying, people say that learning is fun. Yes. Are we really creating fun through learning, which really makes the students motivated, excited to learn, as well as excited to give an assessment? When we say there is an assessment, students should never feel stressed. Students should always feel excited to give that particular assessment, to perform, to demonstrate themselves. Just understand yourself whether the students are really enthusiastic, feeling excited to take the assessments of yours. The next principle is students need to understand clearly what is expected of them in assessed tasks. That's what I'm saying. The assessment should be transparent. The student should know your expectation. Never, give some assessment, which is a closed one and which makes the student understand only when that particular questionnaire is in their hands. They need to know well in advance, right? So the rubrics really help them in understanding the tasks, understanding the facilitator expectation, so that the student learns accordingly and he demonstrates accordingly. So here, see what OB says is, as a faculty, when it comes to the delivery, we need to understand the student. But when it comes to the assessment, the student has to understand us. So the student to understand, we need to tell them our expectations. We can tell them our expectations through rubrics. This is how, the closed loop of the OBE assessment. So then moving to the fifth principle of assessment, it says that the criteria for assessment should be detailed, transferable, it should be transparent and justifiable. So now, as I said, give a rubric which is always detailed, which is transparent, and it should be justifiable. So means, again, when you're giving detailed, you're not supposed to give something which is not taught. You're not supposed to give something which can't be done within the given time. So whatever you're giving, it should be justifiable for the student. The student should get convinced, yes, this is an assessment that I have to do. This is something learning I have to done. This is something I have to demonstrate. And this is something, yes, I have to get the marks. Someone gives a very lengthy, assignment and gives for 2 marks. And the same question sometimes comes for the 10 marks, so which is not justifiable. And students need specific and timely feedback on their work, not just a grade. So just giving that you are passed, you are failed, you got 15 out of 20, this is not what the student want. The student want a feedback. So as I said, the formative assessments always helps. The purpose of the formative assessments is to give the feedback for the student on his learning. So as I said, kindly use the formative assessments that you conduct as a part of your course for giving the feedback to the students. That's where, discuss, spend some time, maybe in office hour or whenever you get time, discuss the paper with the student. So what exactly to be done, what exactly they have did. So everything has to be discussed in detail with the student. This actually has to take place, and this is really going to help the student in understanding that, yes, when this question comes, I have to demonstrate like this. When this question comes, I have to answer like this. And for this, I am not knowing this, so I have to learn this, that the student gets. And the next important principle is too much assessment is unnecessary and may counter the productive as well. So here always I say, student is coming to learn, not always to get assessed. So most of the time, the activity should be of learning. So that's where I said the assessments also should help the maximizing learning. Otherwise, if you spend most of the time just for conducting assessments which are not helping the student for further learning, which are just helping in grading. So this is nothing but, wasting or not properly utilizing the valuable time of the student for his learning. So this should be avoided. The next important principle is assessment should be undertaken with an awareness that an assessor may be called upon to justify the student result. Yes. So when you are assessing them, when you give some score, maybe your superior, maybe the student, maybe a stakeholder, when they ask you to justify your assessment, you always need to be there in such situation. If you fail to justify, means you have not done the proper assessment. So this is another important principle which we have to strictly practice. The next principle is the best starting point for countering plagiarism is in the design of the assessment task, as we know that. Yes, the plagiarism is an important aspect. The most of the assignments, examinations which the student write are getting plagiarized. So in Indian education system, we have an approach, we come across, copying, taking, some malpractice, or maybe some digital or a slip, people write. But mugging an answer, which is already in the textbook, and writing the same is also a malpractice, and which is nothing but called as a plagiarism. So we need to encourage the student to understand and to demonstrate the assessment in his own statements, and which when evaluated, which when verified through plagiarism, so that answer should be plagiarism free. Of course, this has to be practiced. I understand this is a challenging, but at least has to start beginning. At least the plagiarism check has to be done for the technical seminars, has to be done for the project reports, the lab reports, etc. This is further going to improve the student learning as well. Then the 10th principle is the group assessments need to be carefully planned and structured. When we talk about group assessment, the major issue that takes place is the students of good grade will form one group, the students of average one group, and the student of below average one group. This grouping will never help in improving learning. The grouping has to take place with diverse students. There should be a brighter one, there should be an average and below average. Because in the group assessment, the discussion takes place. The below average learns from an average and average learns from a brighter. And the brighter will have some ideas. Brighter will come up with an initiation and will take a lead, which helps the average and below average also to participate in that particular assessment. This approach is really going to maximize the student learning and keeps the motivation as well. So this has to be strictly practiced. So when we are going for group assessments, yes, we need to follow this approach. Otherwise, this is never going to help. Then the 11th principle talks about when planning and wording assignments or questions, it is vital to mentally check their appropriateness to all the students in the class, whatever their cultural differences are. Not only the cultural differences, your question verb or your question statement should not make the students to run for a dictionary, right? So never create such ambiguity. Use the simple or your course language and give a clarity of what exactly you are asking. So this is something very much required when it comes to the 11th principle of assessment. Coming to the 12th one, the systematic analysis of the student performance on assessed tasks can help identify areas of the curriculum which needs improvement. So if yes, all these principles are properly practiced and through the assessments, whatever the feedback that we analyze, so the feedback has to be taken first of all. From that particular feedback analysis, we get an input to the curriculum as well. So for the curriculum, not just the stakeholders' feedback, but the assessment feedback is also an important aspect. Whether the students are able to perform well. whether the students are not performing well on a particular task. If they are not performing well, that may be because of the faculty unable to teach, or the department lacks that expertise, or there might be some prerequisite topic missing because of which students are unable to understand. So there is a lot of analysis that can take place, and the assessment analysis by the faculty also should become an input to the curriculum for further improvement as well. These are the 12 principles of assessment that every faculty has to practice to make the assessments more matured. And in fact, I also want to discuss one more research paper which talks about assessments for maximizing the learning. These are all the scientific proved approaches which I am discussing. As a faculty member, we need to practice. Here, this particular article again, talks about the assessments and how they really help the maximizing the learning. These, what I can say, discussions will help us in correlating our day-to-day practices as well. Let me take the very first, assumption or the issue, right? We say that first, what we need to do is we need to test on what we teach. Are we really doing that? So there is always a discussion on this among the faculty members we see. People say that we need to teach the students to think for themselves. That's where I'm giving a question of higher order. But please understand, when you have not taught that, you are not supposed to give that particular question. So this is a regular practice that we see. So people say that, the untwisted, the unexpected twists people give in the questions. And people say that they have to understand. And, people say that, I'm going to give a very tough question paper. And my question paper is going to have a lot of twists and you have to clear it up. So the unexpected twists for a student, when it is a twist, when it is something unexpected, means it is not learned. It is not taught. But this doesn't mean that we have to do spoon feeding. When I'm saying not to give unexpected twists, when I'm saying, when you're not just giving, twists is challenging them. What I mean to say is, while you are delivering, ensure that you are delivering to the higher level. You are creating expectations in the students while you deliver. And when the students are clear with the expectations, give an assignment. When the students are clear with the expectations, whatever the question that you give, it is never a twist for them. It is never such a challenge for them, as they are aware of your expectation. So that's where I say people acquire skills through practice and feedback. Please understand this. This is an important one as well. Mention them that no one has ever presented evidence that testing students on unpracticed skills teaches them anything. So the last statement of my slide will give you a meaningful understanding. So that is, never test the student for something which you have not taught. Never test for something where you have not created an expectations for the students. So that's why assess the student on what exactly you have taught. And you are not bounded. You are given the freedom to teach to the level you want and assess them to the level that you have delivered. This is going to help the students with the motivation, right, to give the assessments. Otherwise, it is going to create a demotivation, because your class, your session is the place for them to learn. And you are the source for them to create expectation on their learning. When that expectation is missing and assessment is asked, there is a synchronization missing and the student will get demotivated. The next important aspect is always consider handing out a student guide or a study guide 1 or 2 weeks before each test. Just the practice look at. We give material 1 or 2 days before and we ask the student to come for an examination. And of course, Student fails to do that. Students fails to learn your handout. So that's where the lecture handout or the material that you give and which is a source for your assessment, that should be given well in advance for the student. There should be enough time for them to go through. A simple example here, it says that it makes no sense to tell the students, here's a 574 page textbook. You are responsible for all this. And I'm going to put the exam tomorrow or day after tomorrow. And there is a saying here by one researcher, Jim Stice. He says, teaching is not a mystery religion, right? It should not be an horror. Okay. So we have to give the students the material well in advance. And as well, to keep the students motivated, there should be no surprises and tests. Once the question paper comes, you should not get surprised when this is taught. Or, how this has to be answered. That assumption the student should never fall into. So that's where, so we have to ensure that there should be no surprises on the test. But again, I'm saying this is also not spoon feeding. We have to create a challenge, but with an expectation. We have to provide the information well in advance. And the material that which you provide, the materials also, when the student is reading, has to create an expectation for the student. So that's what I'm saying, we use Bloom's for the higher order level learning. And when you're giving a material, in the material, use the terms of higher order level learning, analysis, evaluate, create. That makes the student understand, yes, there might be a question that comes which talks about evaluate, create. Never always have your material only with explain. That makes the student understand that your assessment is going to be only at the understand level. So here, even mapping your handout or material to the outcome-based education or the Bloom's level is very much important. And this material also should create an expectation, because material is nothing but your own source, your own representation in the writing form to the student. So that's how this is another parameter which helps in maximizing the learning. And the next factor is minimize the speed as a factor in performance on the tests. Of course, if it is not a competitive examination and the time is not always a factor for assessment, please see that, right? When you're giving an examination, the assessment, student should have some time to think. So if it is a 3 hours exam, student should be given at least 30 minutes to think. So means you need to plan examination only for 2.5 hours, but vice versa happens. A 3-hour assessment is for 4 hours, which can be completed in 4 hours. From the minute one student keeps on, trying to attempt, and he will not get the time to think. So this should never happen. So we need to see that, when we are preparing a question paper, so at least give, 20% of the time for the student to think, because assessment has to involve a cognitive activity, right? A student has to think how to answer, has to plan how to answer. There should be some enough time that should be there. So yes, when you design a question paper assessment and before going for, please evaluate yourself or with your colleague, whether this particular assessment or the questionnaire can be answered in the stipulated time, whether the student has some time to stop and think. If not, please reduce that particular questionnaire and give some time. This is a very good practice that we have to do, and this really helps, because a student comes with the best learning, spend enough time on your material, had 100% of attendance, and he comes for a test, and but he failed to answer in the stipulated time because the time required is more. So then again, it demotivates the student. So that's why minimize the speed as a factor. Never, unless it is a competitive, never take that as a consideration. So next, factor is always work out a test from the scratch. When you have what you want in the final version, then revise it to eliminate the flaws you discover and try it again. So when you prepare an assessment, please take some time to review it, to evaluate it. Of course, not by yourself. You can give you to a colleague, ask them to review the questionnaire once. That really gives you a feedback, because you're going to a student, and student should not fall into an ambiguity or a confusion, demotivated. So we need to first evaluate the assessment by ourselves. We have to do it by ourselves or at least by a colleague. Yes, of course, sometimes we do not like it. Of course, I say, I don't like it. So what I do? So the assessment questionnaire or the question paper has to be designed on a day, take a break, and then again, you look at the question paper after some time, after a day. Then of course, you are able to find you're able to get the feedback on your question paper, because the moment you have designed and the moment you want to look at, you always be positive about what you did, so you will never find a feedback for that. So at least what I say is, uh, a question paper designing has to take 2 days. One day you design and one day you have to spare for getting the feedback of your own question paper. Without getting a feedback, without convincing yourself, never put that particular assessment forward to a student. This is something practice we have to do, and this practice really helps them motivated. Otherwise, if something goes wrong, they get demotivated as well. Then there is another important aspect which we do uh, in designing question papers in assessments. So we have the questions like part A, part B. So there is a question, we have take 1A, 1B. And when it comes to this A and B part, never give questions like, they can attempt the B part only when they can attempt the A part. So what happens is, if they fail to attempt the A part, they also fail to attempt the B part as well. So never give that intercorrelation. So to make it more transparent, you have to see that both are independent. Of course, sometimes you might say that that's a problem, and the output of the problem one will become an input of the problem. So in that case, nothing worry, just mention in the part B from where it has to start. So simple, I have an example here. It says that it was 42.8 centimeters regardless of what you actually got. So the part B has to start from there. So whether he failed to answer the part A, at least part B he takes from that particular data and he starts implementing. So this is something again motivates them. So never give the questions part questions which are dependent on one another. If they are dependent on one another, give an input data, and from which at least they can attempt the part question as well. So this is something required. So we need to decouple that particular question papers. Then this is a practice that we have to do, and this also helps in further simplifying the grading mechanism also. So the other one. So now we know that classrooms are diversified, right? We have brighter, average, below average students. Yes, when you are giving an assessment, of course, we need to evaluate the testing of the brighter and weaker student as well. So you have an understanding of your own class. So what the scientific approach says that is, the discriminate the test with the 10 to 15% of the questions. These 10 to 15% of the questions will help us in evaluating the brighter students. Of course, there are various practices for this. Almost 80% of the question paper remains same, and the 20% changes for the brighter students. So this helps them in challenging and understanding their higher level of learning. Or sometimes give the same question paper, but in that question paper, give max of 10 to 15% of the questions, which are a bit challenging, which the brighter students can attempt. Of course, the weaker can't attempt. Why we are limiting only to 10 to 15% is because if this percentage goes beyond, then what happens is the assessment is going to become the brighter, and the weaker students are going to lose the grading, or they might get failed in the course as well. So that's where always ensure that when you are designing a question paper, in that don't go beyond 10 to 15% of the questions which can be attempted only by your brighter students, because you have an understanding that you can tell as a faculty that the brighter students only can answer these questions, and those questions should not be more than 10 to 15%. There is an approach, we call it as a differentiated learning. I'm not going to get deeper into that. This is another scientific approach. The differentiated learning approach helps us in handling the diversified students at the same instance in a classroom, because generally this is a difficulty we experience. We go to the class, and when we start teaching, and when we concentrate much on slow learners, and the brighter student always feels bored, and they feel that sir is very slow in delivering the context. as I could understand it, and the next 10 minutes is teaching the same. Whereas if I concentrate on the brighter students, weaker students fails to catch me. So to overcome with this approach, with this difficulty, there is a learning mechanism. We call it as teaching mechanism. We call it as differentiated learning. So that mechanism again speaks the same. So that's where here in this maximizing learning, so try to keep 10 to 15% of the questions discriminated for higher level people. Okay, so this is another aspect that need to be practiced. So this is, of course, we already discussed, but again there is further to discuss over here that what we generally do this. So what we do is most faculty member for their formative assessments, they will be more generous in giving score, and when they are so generous in giving the scores for the formative tests, like assignments, assessments, quizzes, in the summative assessments, generally students scores low as well. The other side, if you see, there are some summative tests which happens as well. So we call mid one and mid two. Actually, they are also summative tests because they are the tests which are planned earlier. But whereas your assignments, quizzes, class tests, they are not formative tests. What generally the faculty do is for these quizzes and assignments in class tests, they give the maximum marks. But for those, what I can say, the internal assessments like CAT 1, CAT 2 or semester end examination, they will be very rigid in evaluation. But we have to do vice versa. Because as I said, formative assessments gives a feedback. Be very rigid in giving the grading for your formative assessments like your internal class tests, because they are for the purpose of grading, feedback. And students should know the cost of that particular mistake while they are giving the internal exams, in class tests. And when they understand that, they will perform the best in the summative tests. So this is what exactly need to be done. Here there is an example. Of course, students comes and ask you, because they say that, sir, why are you very harsh in giving the score? Out of 10, I did a mistake only for one question, but I got very less score. There is an answer. This slide says, you can say that, look, when you are a civil engineer, if you design 10 buildings and one of them collapses, you're not going to pat you on the back and give you a 90. Yes or no? Because the 10% is going to cost the rest. So that's why basically for your formative test, as the purpose of the formative test is to give feedback, to maximize the learning, be very harsh in giving the scores in these tests. And this is further going to enhance the learning and helps the student in rectifying that particular their error and perform the best in the summative test. So that's what, it also says that small mistakes can cost you a lot in the real world. And this is always, the formative test is always a good time for you to start learning and avoid them as well. So this is another important parameter which helps you in further maximizing the learning as well. The another one is, don't deliberately design tests to make the average grade 60 or less. So tests on which most grades are very low serve no useful purpose. So now when you are designing a question paper, as a teacher, from your teaching, there will be an expectation. The grades should be at least 80% or in a particular level of grade should come. If you are planning for a lower grade, then what happens? So there might be merely either the test is purely designed or the instructor has did a poor job of teaching. Either might happen in place. So that's why sometimes when we feel that the results are low, the results are low means the student failed to perform the demonstrate. Why the student failed to demonstrate? There might be a challenge that your assessment is not properly planned, or you might have not delivered as per the requirement, or the question paper fitness is missing. So that's why low test grades always will demoralize the students. So the low test grade should never come. So that's why the test grade should always be the better, and the designs should happen in that particular place. So we need to ensure that. Okay. So the next one is If you give a test on which the grades are much lower than you anticipated, and you believe some of the responsibility is yours, consider making adjustments. So we call this as a tuning. Say, for example, it's a 100 marks exam and you expected 80 percentage of the performance, but the performance has come only 50 percentage after your evaluation. When the result has come 50 percentage, it means the whole class average is 50 percentage. You expected 70 percentage. The learning has not taken place, right? So then as a teacher, you have to take the responsibility and you have to fine tune that particular grading, because it is obviously your own mistake that the learning has not happened and the students have failed to demonstrate, whole class has failed to demonstrate. So this is something again we have to take care. Suppose if in that case, say for example, you are not willing to do that. In that case, you have a feedback. The student has not performed well for a particular question, for a particular topic. So take a class, take a session, teach them, and after that, give a quiz, give an in-class test, and ask them to demonstrate. And for the demonstrate, get the score, add them to that particular score. So various approaches. It's always as a faculty, your autonomy, and you can do that. And this is also going to help in student going for the maximizing the learning. And the next one is, if you are teaching a large classroom and using teaching assistants to grade tests, take precautions to assure that the grading is consistent and fair. Of course, in some institutions, even there is a concept of large classrooms. So now this has become more practice in the schools now, in colleges now. When there is a course which is offered for multiple sections, so they all combine the people into one class, maybe of 200, 300, and one faculty delivers, and there will be some set of teaching assistants to assist them for evaluation, assessment, etc. So in that case, the assessment will be done by various teaching assistants, and there might be always an assessment error unless properly rubrics are in place. So in that case, as a faculty member, you always need to, as a faculty members, you always, as a professor, you always need to, look at and verify whether your teaching assistants are doing the right job, right? This is very much required. Otherwise, students might get an injustice as well. Then there is another one which says that institute a formal procedure for the students to complain about the test grades. This, yes, students need to get convinced. There should be a complaining mechanism, right? Complaining means not to the higher authority, at least for you. There should be a formal procedure in place. So when the assessments are done, grades are in place, and students are not getting convinced, they always need to, complain. Say means, I say that at least you should give an office hour for them. They need to come to you, they need to talk to you, they need to understand, and they need to get, and your responsibility is to justify. So this is always need to be. And students should never say that my complaints are never heard. And students should never say that I have never got an opportunity to verify my assessment, or my professor has never given a time to discuss. So this should never happen. So there should be a formal procedure for the students to comply, right, to again further verify their test grades. So these are various parameters which really helps in maximizing the learning. But of course, at the end, to conclude, there are some embracing contraries. There is another researcher, Mr. Peter Elbow. He spoke on the contrary side. What he says is faculty members have two conflicting functions actually. One is you should be as a gatekeeper and as a coach. So faculty as a gatekeeper, what is that you need to do? As a gatekeeper, we set and maintain high standards to assure that students are qualified to enter the community, right? So we do not want a student, who has not properly learned, whose learning has not taken place, go to the market, go to the community, right? So that's what the role of a gatekeeper. So we set everything very high. And we want a student who reached that particular, high standards which we have set to reach the community. So this is what as a gatekeeper we do. But the other side, as a coach, we have to do everything to empower that particular students to reach the particular high standards. So both again, lies with us. And the assessments are at the heart of both the functions. As I said, course design is as a gatekeeper setting heights. And the next one is coaching is nothing but your teaching learning strategies. And as a coach, as a gatekeeper to move them out into the community, the assessment comes in. So that's where uh, be fair enough with your assessments, practice the most ethical ways, ensure that the learning is happened as per the outcomes as well, plan the assessments for what you delivered, ensure your expectations have reached the students, prepare the proper rubrics, and reach out to the students for assessments. Definitely, the students will demonstrate well. Students will get the feedback and they are able to maximize their learning as well. Right? Moving forward, I was talking about some technologies. So there are various technologies available for assessment. So when it comes to the technologies, people always think the technologies are available only for teaching, but there are some technologies available for assessment. I listed a few, and you can of course take. There are many other which you can search from internet. Clickers is one, Kahoot is one, Google Forms, Survey Monkey. There is various tools that are in place, right? So just with this, I would like to end my session over here, and I am open for Q&A.